And this is the chapter. The clicker is not working.
There you go. It just works.
Okay. This is the chapter which is the most theological chapter, the one where he does sort of explicit theology and Bible study in relationship to creation and ecology. And so it's a fun chapter in that sense, and a lighter feel to it than some of the chapters where he's actually talking about the problems. This one, of course, is focused on how we can, well, the conversion, the intellectual and spiritual conversion that we are called to. And just as I mentioned that a scientist friend of mine said that the Pope got the science right, I just recently read an article in the Way journal that said that he got the Bible right. So that's nice to know that a biblical scholar thinks that he used the Bible in an appropriate way, that sometimes church documents, do kind of a proof texting approach, and that wasn't what this scholar thought that he was doing. So right at the beginning, he addresses a question which actually somebody here actually addressed it to me as well, as that is, he has already said that this document is going to be addressed to everybody in the whole world, all people, and yet here he's presenting the gospel of creation, which obviously is not language that everybody can relate to. So he acknowledges that very directly, and then he says that he concludes that section. Nonetheless, science and religion, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into intense dialogue, notice that word again, fruitful for both. So that he doesn't use the term believers and unbelievers, but science and religion, which are very different perspectives, he says both can benefit from this dialogue, which is what he is going to be entering into. So chapter 2 has 7 sections, which we'll go through one at a time. The first section is called the light offered by faith. So focus directly on faith itself. And he says, the damage that has been done to the world requires Christian wisdom, along with all other human cultures and forms of wisdom, to repair it. So again, he's addressing that question of why are we putting our voice into this when many people think they don't want to listen to our voice? But he says the world needs our voice, as well as other voices. So not only our voice, but it does need our voice. And then he refers to John Paul II and said that in John Paul II's words, Christians must realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty toward nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. So he says ecological commitment is not optional. It is not just an option if you feel like it or if you're drawn to it or it's your thing, but rather it is an essential part of faith. So similarly to the quotation that we heard earlier today, that justice and peace are a constitutive part of our faith. Likewise, he explicitly identifies ecological commitment as constitutive in that sense. And the next section focuses in on the Bible, and actually this particular section focuses primarily on Old Testament and what Old Testament offers to an ecological vision. And a few of the key points that he picks up that he says show the Bible's perspective on this. One is creation and the theology of creation, and in particular that God says, behold, it was very good, that creation is good. Another would be law. And he gives as an example, not the only part of the law, but that one example would be that the law in the Old Testament sets boundaries even in how animals can be treated. So showing that the law does give guidance in relationship to the care of the earth. And then Sabbath. And Sabbath is actually going to be one of his more important themes developed particularly in chapter 6. But the focus on the Sabbath, both as showing the gift character of creation and also as a time of rest. And that rest is not only for humans, but it's also for the land and for the animals. Another part of the Old Testament vision, justice, the insistence, the repeated insistence that the fruits of the earth must be shared with the poor. They belong to the poor equally with others. And then finally, praise, that and of course, especially the Psalms, but other parts of the Old Testament as well, depict all creatures praising the Lord. In some ways, this is the core of his theology when he says, we are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us. And so the critique that he's making of humanity, particularly modern humanity, is that we have begun to think in some way that we are God and that the earth belongs to us. But rather, the earth is the gift of God, and it belongs to God. He says the Bible depicts humans in three fundamental relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth. And that each of these three is an essential part of the relational character of who we are as human beings. Actually, it's been noted that the medieval theology affirmed this sort of three-cornered aspect of theology much more clearly than modern theology has. That modern theology got so focused on God and humans that it kind of dropped out creation as a part of both of the manifestation of God and as a responsibility for humans. And then he comes back to the theme of sin, that sin is broken relationships, a sort of simple definition of sin, but that it would be any of these relationships: a broken relationship with God, a broken relationship with another human being, or a broken relationship with the earth. And he says the harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. And then he addresses directly this question: what is dominion? We're all familiar with, very familiar with the Genesis 1:26, where one of the typical translations is that God says to the man and the woman, let them have dominion over the fish and the animals and so on. Of course, there's other translations, but he's going to address this here. And he says that the key point is, of course, that it does not mean dominating, which unfortunately is how it often has been understood. And that might be a picture of what it looks like when we take it as dominating, that the human person has the right and the sometimes even the desire simply to devastate the earth. But instead, that he says it looks more like this, more like tilling and keeping, and that would be actually a more accurate, and even Bible scholars, many of them, say similarly that would be a more accurate even translation of the meaning in Genesis. And then he has this quote from Deuteronomy, which I really love, so I feature it here. It says, if you chance to come upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. So he's quoting this as an example of the Old Testament. Says has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism unconcerned, for other creatures. That there are very specific injunctions to care and to be responsible and to let others have their space and their life. And then he goes on to talk about what are creatures. And he says that each and every creature reflects a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness, possesses its own particular goodness and perfection, and has a value of its own in God's eyes. So this is all a part of affirming that creatures are created by God. So they're the relationship that the creatures have, every creature has, its first relationship and its defining relationship is its relationship to God, not to us. So that, and then he quotes the German bishops who affirm we can speak of the priority of being over being useful. So the creatures are not here in order to be useful to us. It so happens that some of them are useful to us, but that is not what their value or their purpose or their sort of essence is. That he then says that if we return to the order depicted in the Bible, one of the things that we would return to would be the Sabbath. Again, this is something that he comes back to several times. Because the Sabbath is an affirmation that it is God who created the earth, God who cares for the earth. You know, part of Sabbath, the theology and spirituality of Sabbath is to let God care for us, and to celebrate that. That Sabbath is meant to be a joyful day. And so that the Sabbath is an essential part for him of the return to the order of the Bible. The third section of this part of chapter 2 is entitled The Mystery of the Universe, and this is the one where he's going to do he's going to allude at least to some of the sort of deeper theological concepts. First he says, for theology it's essential to think of the universe not simply as nature, but as creation. It is a gift that comes from God. So the difference is creation refers everything to God as creator, whereas nature, in a sense, refers to the horizontal relationships of things to one another, which is appropriate if you're studying them, say, in science or whatever, but that for theology, we need to think of the universe as creation. And he says, creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. The world came about as a result of God's decision, not from chaos or chance, and this exalts it all the more. And of course, this is a different perspective than that of science. Science basically would, or as far as science can go, is to say that there's to point to the chaos from which order emerged, and to point to many elements of chance within the way the Earth has developed. And it was not to deny that level of reality, but to say that we also, as we're looking at this theologically, must also say, and even more fundamentally say, that there is a choice of God to create. In this universe, shaped by open and intercommunicating systems, we can discern countless forms of relationship and participation. This leads us to think of the whole as open to God's transcendence, within which it develops. This is a packed statement, which would take longer to spell out, but essentially he's saying something about the fact that we find open systems and participative systems and relational systems everywhere actually points to that dimension of God as well, and God's transcendence as being the ultimate direction toward which these open systems are open. So he says creation is radically open to God, and yet it is not in itself divine. And it's because creation is fragile, changeable, and evolving that humans have a duty to care for it and to help it develop. as God desires. So he's affirming evolution. He's affirming the changing quality of creation, and we have to realize that even older theologies didn't understand that concept of evolution or of change in the same way that we must understand it today, because of the recognition of change. So older theologies understood creation in a much more static sense, that if God created an elephant, that elephant was that way because God created it that way, rather than through a long process. So anyway, that again, this can get into many more complex statements, but that changeability and the fact that it's evolving points to a need for humans to participate in that as God's partners. God is intimately present to each being without impinging on the autonomy of his creature, and this gives rise to the rightful autonomy of earthly affairs. So here he's alluding to a very classic Thomist theological principle that God's causality is not in competition with natural causality, so that even though God, and the transcendence of God and the presence of God is the most fundamental reality of each creature, that nonetheless creatures also have a rightful autonomy to, in the sense of developing according to their own character. The Spirit of God has filled the universe with possibilities, and therefore from the very heart of things, something new can always emerge. So the presence of God makes possible newness, and so this is a way of articulating a theology of evolution, of spirit-filled evolution, you can say, that God is present to and in and with all things, and yet also lets all things evolve according to their created nature. But that God's presence and God's way of being in relationship to all things makes it possible for something new always to emerge. Then he wants to affirm the uniqueness of the human person. He says, evolution is a reality, yet humans exhibit signs of a uniqueness which transcends the spheres of physics and biology. So again, some scientific perspectives don't want to look at humans as having that uniqueness, but the Pope does want to affirm that, so to not be reductionistic in that sense. He says the sheer novelty involved in the emergence of a personal being within a material universe presupposes a direct action of God and a particular call to life and to relationship on the part of a thou who addresses himself to another thou. So the emphasis on the God's personal act of creating human beings and personal address to human beings. Oops, I think I got ahead of myself. Then he says, still, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. So even though we are unique and specially created by God, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not in us. Rather, all creatures are moving forward with us and through us towards a common point of arrival, which is God, in that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illumines all things. So this is really important. The insects and the animals and the plants and all those creatures also have a divine destiny, and they are moving with us toward that. It's not, and sometimes we've understood that the divine destiny belongs to us alone, and that is not what he's affirming. So going further into this question of what are the creatures and what is their message, he says God has a teaching for us in every creature that we encounter. And then he goes on to say, the Spirit of life dwells in every living creature and calls us to enter into relationship with him, that is, with God. So creatures actually bear both a message and a presence, in some sense, of God for us. And then he adds, creatures exist only in dependence on each other to complete each other in the service of each other. And that, of course, is a theology of ecology, because ecology is the science of the fact that all creatures are interdependent and all need one another. He then says, the entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. And at that point, he inserts the canticle of creation. And actually, I think I won't read it right now because we're running, as usual, I'm running a little bit late. But you all know this very, very well. And the Pope himself puts this part of the canticle into the encyclical to affirm that the creatures as being the presence of God to us. The fifth part of this chapter is called the Universal Communion. And it's that all living things on earth form a universal family of sublime communion. And actually, even scientifically, life is one family. That is to say, the scientists, this picture of the tree of life actually shows that all life evolves over long, long and complex routes from a single beginning. And that if you look at DNA, there is shared DNA of all life on Earth. So it isn't just a metaphor, it's a fact that they are all our cousins, all of them, and even the plants and the slime molds and fungi and all those things, they are our cousins. That's very, very distant, but that's a very important recognition. And he says, God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. So he wants us to feel our familyhood in that affective way. But then he comes back to our care for other humans and says it would be inconsistent for us to love the animals or even the slime molds or whatever and not to be loving our own human neighbors. And especially those in greatest need, those caught up in human trafficking, the poor, and he alludes to destroying another human being deemed unwanted and so on as inconsistent. And then he says peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes. They're not separate, they completely are interconnected with one another. The sixth section is called the common destination of goods. So coming back again to this idea of the common good and the common things that are for everyone. And he says the rich and the poor have equal dignity, for the Lord is maker of them all. So the rich person at the resort and the poor family camped or living on the dump are equal in God's sight. And that we must remember that Christian tradition has never recognized the right of private property as absolute or inviolable, but has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. Once again, this concept of the collective good, the common good, the natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity and the responsibility of everyone. If we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. If we do not, we burden our consciences with the weight of having denied the existence of others. So whenever we think that this is mine, there's an inaccuracy in our thought that in some sense it is something that we have responsibility for at that particular moment within the collective good of all, and that we use it and care for it for the sake of the whole. And then the seventh section of this chapter is called the gaze of Jesus. And he identifies Jesus' human life as our best model of living in full harmony with creation. And a few specific points: that Jesus affirmed God as Father of all, that he contemplated nature with fondness and wonder, that he did not reject the pleasures and the good things of life, and he worked with his hands in daily contact with matter. But the most profound mystery of all to ponder is that of the Word made flesh, the incarnation. And the Pope doesn't use this phrase, deep incarnation, but a deep incarnation is a theology that's been developed, started by a Lutheran theologian named Neil Gregerson. And basically the idea that the incarnation was not just a historical event that happened 2,000 years ago, but that the incarnation, in some sense, is embedded into the whole character of the total creation, so that the incarnation has always, in some way, been at work and present. And that is similar to that is what the Pope is saying: the mystery of Christ is at work in a hidden manner in the natural world as a whole, without thereby impinging on its autonomy. And thus, then he adds, thus the creatures of this world no longer appear to us under merely natural guise, because the risen one is mysteriously holding them to himself and directing them toward fullness as their end. And so Gregerson, the theologian, also talks about deep resurrection, that if the incarnation permeates all of creation, then also the resurrection permeates and is the destiny of all of creation. So again, not only us, but all creatures. And finally, the very flowers of the field and the birds which Jesus' human eyes contemplated and admired are now imbued with his radiant presence. So Christ's incarnation into the soil, the water, the air, the tree of life on earth means that all of that bears the image of Christ today. So that's my presentation, and maybe we have a couple of minutes for any questions or comments.
One way of understanding the word from dominion, from Latin, domus, which means at home, live at home with here.
Okay, thank you.
Is it scientifically correct to say that every single person's DNA is absolutely unique?
Well, I'm not a scientist, but as I understand it, that there's a unique combination. Every person would have a unique combination, I guess, but that, of course, vast amounts of it, the patterns are the same. And even like chimpanzees, we share about 98% of our DNA is the same with the chimpanzee. And then it goes down with different other animals, the amount, the percentage.
But how can the criminologist then insist that if you got my DNA and it's on some kind of weapon or something, it belongs to me alone?
Yeah, well, it is unique, but I'm not sure if I can explain but it is unique, and yet it's also shares a pattern. Again, I'm not the best person to try to explain it, but it is unique. So yes, but I guess it would be like there's so many possible combinations. Like you have a string of DNA, which I guess is something like 46 pairs or whatever, and there's so many different possible ways that those can be combined, and yet everybody has the same string. Again, I'm not the best person to try to explain it.
Building blocks. Every human being has the makeup of a human being, but we have red hair and blue eyes and characteristics and tendencies toward illness and other things where DNA has been combined in different ways, different from each human being. So every human's unique, but the building blocks that make up a human being are basically the same. They're all the human building blocks. That's the way they're arranged and put together.
Okay, thank you.
It's still awesome.
Very awesome.
And when Francis talks about all creatures sharing in the resurrection, what does this mean? Dogs are going to be in heaven? What does it mean that all creatures are going to share in the resurrection?
Well, it means that the destiny of all, I mean, the way he puts it is the destiny of all creatures is toward God. In other words, all creatures come from God, and all creatures, their ultimate fulfillment is for which God intends them is in God. And I mean, that requires to think about that question. Of course, requires thinking about the resurrection and what is the resurrection, and what is heaven. And so, if we have a concept of heaven as being sort of another place where human relationships are recreated, maybe it's hard to think of having all the billions of creatures there as well. But somehow thinking of heaven and resurrection, and again, these are all speculative ideas, but as being the permeation of the entire cosmos with the light of God, somehow, so that everything that has ever been is fulfilled and illumined. I mean, so there's different. You have to think maybe a little differently about what does heaven mean, what does resurrection mean. But it's a complex topic.
This brings to mind one statement that incarnation began 14.5 billion years ago, and in Colossians 2, that all things that exist are held together by Christ too. What blows my mind is the guy stoking bodies at Auschwitz into the furnaces is being held in existence by the Christ, which is raises the whole question of evil, which just raises a huge question. It blows the mind.
Yeah, and this particular chapter, as is typical of, he doesn't focus in on that question of evil. I mean, there's a more optimistic attempt to present a sort of a theology of light almost.
I'm sensing either a contradiction in what he's writing or a mystery, maybe. I love the idea in number 80 where he says, the Spirit of God has filled the universe with possibilities, and therefore from the very heart of things, something new can always emerge. I think it's a beautiful statement. But then in 81, he says, the emergence of a personal being within the material universe presupposes a direct action of God. Why, if the Spirit is already in all of creation, does the movement from nature to human need God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good question. And one of the things that I would say about Pope Francis, he is not he's not a systematic theologian in the same way like the last two popes that we've had were much more deeply trained in systematic thinking, and therefore, and of course, their writings, however, were much less interesting to people. And this is me saying this, I think of Pope Francis as, in the best sense of the term, a kind of a rhetorical theologian. Meaning by that, not rhetoric in the bad sense of like just, fluff, but rhetoric in the sense of persuasive, convincing, beautiful moving ability to express theological concepts, and that's really what he tries to do, more so than to be completely systematic. I think he's trying to affirm two things that he thinks are really important to affirm. One being that God is present and always has been present to everything, but he feels that, and this is of course again very traditional within magisterial theology, that to affirm the uniqueness of human beings, that we're not, so he's not going there are schools within certainly within ecological thought, but even within theological thought, that want to say no, human species is no different from any other species, has no more value, no greater purpose, and no greater specialness. So that would be one idea, and if you, in a radical affirmation of evolution, could point in that direction. We're just one more species that's gotten popped out of the stew. And he doesn't want to go there. He wants to say that it's not just by chance, but that it's God's intent and special relation to form humanity. So that does require, for a fully systematic thinking through, it's going to require other people to work out the details.
The question I get often is, my dog and my cat, are they going to be in heaven?
So you're asking me? Well, I think there's, again, I think you can feel free to say yes, but of course the problem with the question is people's concept of heaven. And in one way, I mean, it's not that it's bad that people think of heaven in a kind of simplistic way as a place somewhere over there where we're all going to see each other and it's going to be kind of like, a great family reunion barbecue. And if that helps people to think about heaven, it's not that it's bad, but it's probably not the most theologically accurate way to think about heaven. And of course, at the barbecue, the dog and the cat have to be there too. Okay, I think we probably have to stop. Is that right? Okay, so thank you.